I'm joined now by former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, the MP for Bournemouth East. Tobias, thank you for joining me from Munich. First of all, I have to ask you, how are you and your family? What a dreadful series of events you had to endure last week from these pro-Palestinian protesters effectively gathering in a mob outside your home.
Yeah, it was very surprising on a number of accounts to be told by the police, give them fair gratitude. They were able to see on the internet that an event was going to take place outside my house, warned me off to go there. But you don't expect this sort of behavior in today's day and age. And we need to make sure it does not become the norm. The MPs, I expect a bit of rough and tumble. They expect criticism publicly and so forth. But when it comes to your house, you'd hope that there would be a line drawn on what is acceptable behavior. And I'm very grateful to Tom Tugendhat, the security minister, and Chris Felt, the policing minister, to ask the police to look at the current laws to see whether they need to be improved. Because otherwise, it's not just the impact on families and so forth. It's also the next generation of parliamentarians, the people that we'd like to step forward into public life. More people would be put off by wanting to become an MP if we don't recognise some standards of which behaviour in demonstrations is allowed to operate.
I mean, I totally agree with that. And I see that you have praised Dorset Police for giving you advance warning so you didn't go back to your home. Although, have any arrests been made of those who descended on your property?
So this was very much a live conversation that evening. They had a series of police cars that were protecting my property, an armed response unit there as well to watch activity. Don't forget that when these demonstrations take place, which are very intensive and dozens of people there, they almost want arrests to take place. They want to ratchet things up. And it was a view of the police on the ground to allow this to sort of fizzle out. They were there for 3.5 hours. They then dispersed. Imagine the number of police required to move them on or to sort of make arrests and so forth. Dorset Police made, I think, the right decision at this time. The bigger question, though, is...
I think we've just had Tobias Ellwood frozen there. Let's bring Nigel Nelson back into the conversation while we try and get Tobias's link back up. This is unfortunately the peril of speaking to somebody at the Munich Security Conference.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
I mean, I can't quite understand how it's now carte blanche for protesters to just descend on the home of MPs. It's not just Tobias Ellwood. We've seen this happen to Wes Streeting. We've had Mike Freer now, the MP for Golders Green, announce that he's got to step down. The threats to him are too much. I had Suella Braverman in this chair a couple of weeks ago telling me that she has had to hold on to her taxpayer-funded bodyguards that she had while she was Home Secretary. Normally, you don't keep them. You go off back into your normal constituency life and you don't need that protection. She does because she keeps on receiving death threats. I mean, in my mind, it's extraordinary that the police have to tell an MP he can't go back to his home.
Yes, it is extraordinary. And bear in mind, Rishi Sunak also had his home attacked. No, it's not acceptable. I mean, certainly protests outside Parliament, that's the place for them.
I think we've got Tobias back. Sorry to interrupt, Nigel. Tobias, hopefully you can hear me again. Sorry, we just lost that link. Look, we've dealt with this issue with the police. Let's talk about the Munich Security Conference you're attending now. The reaction, quite understandably, to Alexei Navalny's death has been that of shock and horror. We've heard the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, talk about consequences for the Russian president. What consequences would you like to see?
Well, we simply just need to recognise how contested, how fragmented our world is becoming. And what President Putin is doing is a great example of that, of crushing opposition, of any criticism in his own country, but the wider intentions of what he wants to do, not just in Ukraine, but beyond. And the big debate here is how do we then manage that? A world that's becoming ever more contested, more fragmented. What is the West doing about it? And the shadow of Trump was here, really was quite... I think a test of the West, indeed the American senators that were all here, because, of course, they're tying in their support for Ukraine with domestic issues to do with the Mexican border. And people in Europe here just simply don't get that. If we don't provide Ukraine the necessary assets, the military equipment that they need to actually take back their territory, then Putin will not stop there. We need to make that clear, that Europe is at war right now, and it will continue and gets worse unless we put this fire out.
I mean, I understand, Tobias, that you wouldn't be agreeing with Trump when it comes to, obviously, this $9 billion aid package, which the Republicans are blocking going to Ukraine. But at the same time, you must side with him when he calls for all of these NATO countries to honour this 2% of defence spending. We've heard Keir Starmer in the Sunday Telegraph sort of question that and say, you know, that he's being divisive and all the rest of it. But come on, I mean, these countries have to step up the cash, don't they?
They do indeed, but you don't do that with your allies by telling Putin to invade a NATO ally. That is not the way forward. And don't forget also that Trump, whilst he was president, actually threatened to pull out of NATO and then pivot to China. That America must understand that if Europe goes back into any form of conflict, larger conflict beyond Ukraine, it will have a knock-on economic consequence to America as well, and cost us more in the long term as well. That's why we need to get this right. That's why we need to focus on supporting Ukraine. And, you know, for their own British defence budget as well. It isn't just Ukraine. We see the Middle East as well. There are complexity of issues. We've entered a new era of insecurity. We are still on a peacetime budget. And we know that our army, our air force and our navy aren't currently overstretched. So some big questions for Britain as well.
Let's bring it back to domestic matters. I've got Jeff on my People's panel in Nottinghamshire today. He's a former military gentleman, and he's basically talking about the number of homeless veterans, 7,000 he claims, many of whom are dealing with PTSD. He says, why aren't the government doing more to help them?
Well, there are many programs to support those. There's the Armed Forces Covenant, which actually obliges all councils up and down the country to make sure that those who have served their country with pride are then given the necessary support they need, particularly if they've got mental health challenges such as PTSD. So I'm sure if we get those details of where your panel were referencing, either myself or certainly you've got Johnny Mercer, who's been so focused on this, so dedicated on this, on making sure that we get the money through to the front line to support our valiant veterans.
OK, some interesting polling in the Sunday Telegraph today suggesting that 70%, Tobias, of Tory voters think it was wrong to ditch Boris Johnson.
Well, we've moved on from that. He's not even MP there. So it's actually a bit of a distraction as to where we need to go. General election is only months away. What are they suggesting? That somehow he then, somebody gives up their seat, he comes back in? My goodness, how disturbing that would be for the Conservative Party to then have another turn of the wheel, another selection process. Really, I think we need to recognise why he departed, why he had to go in the manner that he did. We now have a Prime Minister. Let's back the current Prime Minister. OK, but unfortunately, the country doesn't seem to be backing him. He hasn't pushed the dial any further forward in his favour since announcing his 5-point plan. The plan doesn't seem to be working. I mean, you're very much a centrist Tory. You talk about the importance of the broad church. How's that congregation going? Because the last time I checked, you've lost 2 by-elections and you're 20 points behind in the poll. Yeah, and that's simply because we're not getting the airtime for people like you to scrutinise what Labour are doing, because we're spending the whole time having a bun fight with each other. And you go back, if I may, go back to the centre ground. The centre ground in British politics, the floating voter, that's how you win elections. When you go to extremes, onto the right or to the left, you will not win the general election. Jeremy Corbyn proved that when he was leader. And what we need to do is recognise the big grandees. We've had this conversation before. The big grandees, the big beasts who've won elections have gone for the centre ground. That's where the winning streak should be.
You're getting killed on the right, Tobias. At the end of the day, might the Tories have to entertain a deal with Nigel Farage and the Reform Party?
OK, so it takes you even further to the extreme, gifting that space to Labour, to the centre ground to Labour, and then they will actually then win. This is a false strategy. It really, really is. All right, Tobias Ellwood, thank you very much indeed for joining me from Munich. Lovely to speak to you this morning.